Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, what have you got there?
This is a protective amulet. I just found it near the temple. The monk blessed it in some holy water and said that it would protect the previous owner from illness. The owner has discarded it. Perhaps it didn't work, or perhaps because it's expended.
Fascinating. Did he tell you how it works?
He said that passing it through the blessed water imparts some of the power of the blessing into the amulet, and that power fends off sickness, at least for a while, before they have to go back and buy another one.
So the power fades over time?
Indeed. It's very interesting. I'm not so sure that this works quite the way that they say, but it nonetheless represents veneration of the Buddha and almsgiving, so to use one is still a meritorious act.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be discussing Omamori. What are Omamori? What is their history? What is their significance? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get to it. What are Omamori?
When you visit a Japanese Buddhist or Shinto temple or shrine, you'll usually see these decorated trinkets that take several forms, and they'll be for sale. The most common form is a little pouch about the size of a $50 coin that is very beautifully decorated and hangs from drawstrings. You may also see a little bas-relief statue of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva or a Kami, which is a deity in Shinto, and this will usually be wrapped up in plastic. These Omamori will be for sale usually for around $5 to $10, with all of the money going toward keeping the temple or shrine doors open, and each Omamori has a different prescribed purpose. You'll find them sitting in boxes or shelves that are labeled with something like good financial fortune, or harmony in relationships, or traffic safety. This tells you a little bit about what they're for, but what are they actually for, and how are they meant to be used? The word Omamori is a Japanese word made of two parts. The O part is an honorific or polite prefix that is attached to nouns. We don't have anything like this in English, but in Japanese, when speaking politely, you will use the O before Japanese native nouns and go before Chinese borrowed nouns. The second part, mamori, is the noun form of the verb mamoru, which is to protect. So these little pouches or trinkets are actually little protections, and their specific protective power is specific to those functions we mentioned earlier, such as traffic safety. When Omamori include statues of a specific Buddha, Bodhisattva, or an object associated with one of them, their protective power may be something directly related to that figure. For example, I have an Omamori which is a statue of Fugen, because this year, 2024, is the year of Fugen in the Buddhist zodiac calendar. We've discussed Fugen on a previous episode. He's the bodhisattva of practice, so when you're reciting a sutra and you forget a part, he'll show up on his white elephant to remind you of the part you forgot and assist you in your recitation practice. Thus, the power of this Omamori is to help me with my Buddhist practice, if I were to do any. The first Omamori I ever got when I was in Japan was Fudo Myō's sword, called the Kurikara sword. He uses this sword to cut away your desires and attachments, and so that Omamori helps you be less attached to things and thus less prone to suffering, or dukkha. When they're not specific statues or objects, their protective power is not connected to any specific Buddha or Bodhisattva. For example, a business success Omamori will not have any images of any Buddhas or Bodhisattvas depicted on them. They will usually just be a pretty cloth pouch with lots of fine embroidery. The pouch is not meant to be opened, and you will likely not find anything at all inside it if you do, although historically there used to be things in there, as we'll discuss in a moment. Sometimes the pouch will have a kanji character on it, such as the one for protection, mamoru, or something similar. Something else that's important to know is that Omamori have to be powered up, and then their power fades over time. What I mean by this is that an Omamori does not have any protective power until it has undergone a ritual called omairi. Omairi is another word that is two parts, where the O is the same polite prefix, and mairi is the noun form of the verb maeru, which is an honorific way to say visit. You don't omairi to your dog or to the grocery store. You omairi to a statue of the Buddha, a kami, a temple or a shrine, or the emperor, or something very special and holy like that. So it's almost like the verb form of the word pilgrimage in English. People can do omairi where they go to one of the holy places I mentioned, and they often do. It is common tradition in Japan for a family to go do omairi or a ritual visit to a temple or shrine on a specific holiday, like the New Year or the equinox. However, Omamori can and do go on omairi also, and in fact they have to in order to work ritualistically, during which they are blessed by the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, or the kami they're specifically attached to. The way this is done differs from sect to sect, but it usually involves a monk or a priest taking the Omamori object to the statue or the icon of the deity and chanting over them, perhaps passing them through some purified water, or some smoke, or some fire, or something similar. And that is the omairi ritual. This process is thought to impart a bit of the deity's power into the Omamori, which then gives it the ability to do the function we mentioned earlier. For example, in Shingon Buddhism, the monk takes the Omamori and passes it through the Goma ritual fire. Goma is a monthly ritual that's very important in esoteric Buddhism, which we will describe and discuss another time, but essentially, there's a fire involved, and that fire is very holy and special, and every month, Shingon Buddhist practitioners will pass their Omamori through that fire in order to power it up. This sort of thing has actually been done for me and other attendants as well at the local Shingon temple in my area when we bought Omamori from that temple and had it pass through the Goma fire. As I mentioned, the power fades over time. After about a year, although it depends with different Omamori, the power fades and the Omamori needs to be re-blessed or it needs to be retired entirely. In the event that it needs to be retired, it will usually be burned in a Goma or a similar ritual, or it'll be recycled in the same way other recyclables are. After this, one will have to buy another Omamori to continue to have that kind of protection in their lives. This cycle of buying and recycling is a strong source of income for Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines in Japan and outside of it, as we'll discuss in a moment. Because of the nature of the transaction, purchasing one of these is seen as a donation to the temple or the shrine that you get it from.
What is the history of Omamori?
Omamori became very popular in Japan in the Tokugawa period, or possibly a little bit later. We've talked about this period in previous episodes in the context of the struggles Japanese Buddhism faced during this time, but we should go over those again to give some context for the development of Omamori themselves. The Tokugawa period was the period of Japanese history between 1600 and 1868. First and foremost, we should mention that in this time, Buddhism underwent many significant changes, specifically with regards to its social and political function and its public perception. During the Tokugawa period, Japan closed its borders to other countries and only allowed foreign travelers to visit 4 specially designated port cities. There was a huge surge in nativist studies as well, the academic pursuit of trying to find, celebrate, and appreciate the roots and origins of one's own constructed culture. I say constructed because all culture is constructed. But this academic pursuit of finding these roots often requires a process of essentializing this culture to a very narrow range of experiences and artifacts. This process of constructing a historical backbone to support those narrow experiences and artifacts is not always supported by the evidence, and unfortunately, much of that constructed history and culture is often biased toward a specific agenda in the present day. A concrete example of this in modern times is how people walk around in the US saying things like, "The Founding Fathers wouldn't let this or that happen." First, people have decided that the Founding Fathers are the roots or origins of American culture, which is a very broad generalization and only validates the experiences of white people, or more specifically, wealthy white people, white men. Then they have cherry-picked and revised bits of history to support their chosen range of experiences, such as forgetting that the Founding Fathers included slave owners and religious extremists facing ostracization in Europe. And then they are speaking in the Founding Fathers' voices on issues that would have never come up when those people were alive. This is all done to disguise one's own agenda and give it credibility because of name-dropping famous historical figures. This exact same process happens all across the world, all across time, and it happened in Japan during the Tokugawa period. Nativist scholars sought quote-unquote true Japaneseness in the classical literature of the Heian and Nara periods, which had happened about 500 to 1,000 years prior. Their doing this caused them to elevate and propagate state-oriented Shinto as the native religion of Japan, ignoring that it shares a great deal with Buddhism and was likely brought over to Japan with Chinese and Korean immigrants. In doing this, they came to look down upon Buddhism on the grounds of it originating in India and traveling over from China. They also looked down on it for being obsolete and overly negative. Shinto was seen as so much better because it celebrated the divine origins of the emperor and the Japanese people. This process highly influenced public opinion and the opinions of lawmakers. The result of this was that, first off, Buddhism was blatantly persecuted in a social and political movement called Haibutsu Kishaku, or in English, Abolish Buddhism, Kill the Buddha. In the course of this persecution, many temples were destroyed and many monks were forced to re-enter the life of a layperson. Similarly, many laws were passed that tried to squeeze Buddhism and Buddhists back into the rest of society. For example, laws were passed that permitted monks to eat meat and get married, which they were previously prohibited from doing.
Please put a pin in the word permitting here, audience.
This was an attempt to make monks basically be like everyone else and stop being Buddhists. Additionally, Buddhist temples were turned into government census bureaus. Everybody in a neighborhood was forced to register at the nearest temple, and the temples themselves were forced to carry out ritual functions for that community and report on their population to the Tokugawa government. This policy was originally enacted to root out Christianity, which was seen as inherently seditious and serving colonial interests. Doing this forced Christians to give up their faith and worship at Buddhist temples. However, it also had the effect of financially crippling Buddhist temples because they were forced to carry out rituals, primarily funerals, for everyone in their neighborhood precinct. They primarily took on funerals because most Japanese people had Shinto weddings during this time, since there wasn't really a defined wedding ritual in Buddhism. The reason this was financially detrimental was that these funerals replaced other ritual functions that made the temples more money. Similarly, large temples, which had previously had a large group of people to serve them, now had fewer people to serve because of the way this temple system became organized. In similar fashion, tiny temples, which previously had shrunk or even fallen into disuse, were now being regarded as responsible for staffing themselves with monks and handling larger ritual demands that they didn't always have all the assets to take care of. For example, they may have had to outsource the cremation part, purchase ritual implements, or pay to support a larger staff of monks to carry things out, placing a higher overhead cost on already struggling temples. All this while donation was going down because people weren't going to Buddhist temples to donate anymore because they hated Buddhism during this Haibutsu Kishaku movement. Finally, the last part in all of this is that the cost of this sort of funeral was regarded as a donation, not as a payment for services rendered. This was an emerging reinterpretation of the precept against monastics handling money. So, Buddhist institutions were financially crippled during this time period.
I'd like a little extra context, so let's pull that pin I mentioned earlier. How did passing a law, quote-unquote, permitting something affect what people actually did? Was there an expectation for effective monks to follow these permits, legal or otherwise?
This is a very good question. The laws changing did not necessarily change what every monk did in every case. Most monks at the time were still vegetarian and still celibate. However, there were several important points regarding this legal change by the Tokugawa government. The first is that the ritual duties of the temples increased at a rate that outpaced the rate at which new temples were being founded, especially in the anti-Buddhist environment of Tokugawa period society. Thus, keeping temples from fully dying out often meant that monks would get married and pass the temple on to their first son. This still happens in the modern era, by the way. Many sons of monks inherit small temples from their fathers. Another important point is that the Tokugawa government engaged in a lot of censorship and thought control, and on this point they created a problem with a solution that favored them only. They wanted to decrease the power of Buddhist institutions, so they shaped a pro-Shinto, anti-Buddhist scholarly trend, and when this put a stranglehold on monks, they said, well, if you want to overcome these critiques that your group is archaic and obsolete and outside of society, then you could just join the rest of modern society and get married and eat meat like everybody else. This measure took power and influence away from the Buddhist doctrines and moved it to the government, and it brought Buddhist monks further into contemporary Japanese society, whereas before they might have been outside of it. This solution thus served the Tokugawa shogunate's interests at that time. many monks did begin to eat meat and marry simply so that they didn't stick out and face all kinds of scrutiny and criticizing from people who were part of this Haibutsu Kishaku movement, and also so that their temple could survive the social changes that were going on at the time. All of this brought the entire economy and the entire population centrally under the Tokugawa's control and outside of the control and the purview of Buddhism, coming as it did from India and China and being, as it was, older than the Tokugawa government. Before we get to Omamori, let's go back to this nativist culture idea. I mentioned that Japanese people sought to find Japaneseness in their classical literature canon from the Heian and Nara periods. During this time, classical Japanese literature became incredibly popular, such as the Tale of Genji, the Tales of Issei, the Pillow Book, and more. With the rise of urbanism and cosmopolitanism that took place during this era in Japanese history, literacy rose immensely. So common urban folk read or otherwise became aware of these classical literature works, these books and these stories that were very important in Japanese history. The settings of these books became very special places in the imaginations of the Japanese people, much like Huckleberry Finn, Of Mice and Men, and The Great Gatsby in the American context. Because many of them could not afford to visit the places where these stories took place, such as Mount Fuji, or Nachi Waterfall, or the ancient capital at Kyoto, there arose a market for miniaturized versions of these places that could be purchased and appreciated in the home. These took the form of magazines with illustrations of these places. This led to the increase in print culture and the production of woodblock prints, which are so famous nowadays, especially with the image of the Great Wave off Kanagawa. And it also took the form of tiny figures of Mount Fuji, or tiny little trinkets from Kyoto, the ancient capital, so that you could have a piece of that literary element in your own home. So now let's put it all together. Buddhist institutions found themselves in a serious financial crisis, and the public was becoming increasingly commercial and interested in miniaturized and commodified versions of things. So Buddhist temples began to make and sell little miniature pieces of the Buddha's salvific power, both to support themselves financially and to cater to public desire in an attempt to stay relevant in an increasingly anti-Buddhist society. Shinto shrines also did this, even though they weren't facing such financial ruin as the Buddhist temples were. At this time, Omamori would typically be pouches containing incense, herbs, or tiny strips of paper with prayers handwritten on them. The ones filled with something scented, like incense, are also where the idea of the power fading comes from. You buy this Omamori filled with sandalwood, and after about a year or so, the fading smell is your indicator of the protective power of the Omamori starting to go away. So you would have to take it back and buy another one to recharge the power.
What is the significance of Omamori?
Omamori, particularly Buddhist Omamori, fascinate me to no end because there is no textual backup for them. Similarly, they are exclusively a Japanese thing. They're not found in China or Korea until after Japanese people colonized and occupied regions of those countries during the Second World War. Omamori are an adaptive practice on the part of Japanese Buddhism, something that does not have a textual backup and comes about in response to changing trends in public opinion and circumstance. These types of practices fascinate me endlessly. Omamori were borrowed from Shinto as a means of financially supporting temples in the midst of a period of persecution and struggle for Japanese Buddhism. Whether or not they worked, they were still part of that effort to stay afloat, and the doctrine behind it was an afterthought. It is accepted knowledge that there is no doctrine in the sutras that supports Omamori in Buddhism, and it's entirely well-known history among Japanese Buddhists who are in the know that Omamori as a concept is borrowed from Shinto. That is regarded as being completely okay, because it's seen as an equal transaction between the temple and the temple patron. The patron donates, and the temple gives them a little trinket to signify their donation in return. This trinket signifies the gratitude and the good regards of the temple, and it doesn't have to go any deeper than that. In practice, it does go deeper than that because people have questions, but it doesn't have to. Another reason they fascinate me is that they are an example of a broader trend in religion in general. In an increasingly consumerist, modernist, and anti-communalist world, many religious traditions played into those trends to survive, because there's not a lot of room for them to continue to exist otherwise. Many Christian churches in America, which have been built in the last 20 to 25 years, are often devoid of religious symbols on the outside and look more like Apple stores or shopping malls. Similarly, Many Catholics buy icons and carry those icons around with them in their pockets or wallets, or even put them in their cars or their offices. People in a consumerist, modernist, and anti-communalist world are not interested in religious esotericism or in orthodoxy or in ritual because they're interested in materialism and rationalism and individualism. They don't believe in an afterlife or a pantheon of gods or the self-policing and self-scrutinizing of religious communities. So, where is left for religion? The answer is in the transaction, in the material world, and in the commercial world. People are identifying less and less as religious, and fewer people are going to churches and to temples. But the very human needs that religion has filled for humanity for thousands of years remain, such as spiritual comfort, community, and tradition. So, to fill those needs, but still remain ever materialist, ever rationalist, ever individualist, ever consumerist, people are purchasing objects and experiences to fill those needs. Self-help books fly off the shelves now more than ever. Pseudo-spiritual, whitewashed yoga is more popular in the West than it ever has been. People buy Omamori at their local temple every year, but then don't visit any other time. People want to be able to buy salvation, protection, and spiritual safety. They don't want to have to labor in a religious context in order to get it. Money buys convenience, and Omamori and similar adaptive practices are as convenient as they come. This overall trend I've been describing here is described very aptly by religion scholar Catherine Lofton in her book Consuming Religion, which I will link in the show notes. It argues that religious institutions co-opt capitalistic mechanisms and capitalism co-opts religious mechanisms. Capitalist religious practice often looks exactly like I have described, where you can purchase pieces of the deity's power. Similarly, capitalism functions religiously because a lot of moral and ethical connotations and judgments are affixed to what people consume and buy. For example, if a person does not buy or use deodorant, but instead uses some sort of essential oil concoction, they could face ostracization socially, even if they don't smell bad. Store-bought deodorant serves no health function whatsoever. It's literally just something to cover up a body function that's potentially unpleasant for others, and also to contribute to the creation and the maintenance of this morally charged ideal of cleanliness that we all ascribe to and that we all buy into by buying shampoo and body wash and conditioner and moisturizer and deodorant. To allow the body function of sweating to happen naturally or otherwise, and to not buy into something to cover it up, is seen as a social failing, if not also a moral failing. In general, there is a pre-selected and pre-curated daily routine, which is paved with products to buy and consume, such as pre-selected clothing types, pre-selected electronics, pre-selected soaps and perfumes, pre-selected media to entertain ourselves with, and more. And to fail to succumb to this daily routine and participate in this cycle of consumerism is nonconformity, and nonconformity then will be met with shunning. This is exactly how nonconformity is treated in most organized religious communities as well. Heresy and heterodoxy are not met with acceptance and with any sort of lack of moral judging and ethical judging. It's actually met with being sort of ostracized from the community. This has been an example of how capitalism has taken on some very religious overtones, such as how moral and ethical ideals of cleanliness have been met with a consumer routine, and also how ostracization from a community has been connected to what someone does or does not buy. Another example of how capitalism has taken on these religious overtones specifically has to do with messiah figures. Especially in the last 10 or so years, but probably for much longer, many people have fallen prey to cults of personality. There are many people who are part of the working class who will defend, promote, and show constant deference and respect for people who are often morally dubious or even outright evil, and who are working directly against the interests of that working class. For example, there's a huge number of Westerners who are obsessed with anything and everything Elon Musk says or does. Their god is capitalism, and their messiah is Elon Musk. They believe that because he is the richest man in the world, that means that he is the smartest and the most hardworking, because they have been hoodwinked by the lie that capitalism tells us all, which is that working hard and being smart leads to wealth, and that wealth indicates diligence and intelligence. Because they believe that he's the smartest and hardest working person in the world, they will invest their entire self-worth into him because they're desperate to be like him. Thus, when he does stupid stuff, or says stupid stuff, they defend him to the death because they're defending their own self-worth. This kind of behavior is exactly what happens in ultra-religious communities all across history. People in these communities have invested their entire self-worth in the given myth, and thus will carry out 12 crusades in its name, for example. To tie it all back to Omamori, given that capitalism has so severely infected religiosity in the modern era, it makes me genuinely wonder if Buddhism will continue to survive in the grand long term. To renounce and become a monk is to remove oneself from the daily consumer routine I described earlier, and is thus a form of nonconformity. Remember when I said that Tokugawa lawmakers wanted to force Buddhists back into their daily routines and customs by allowing them to marry and eat meat? That is a prime example of nonconformity in the consumer cycle being met with legal repercussions. As these pressures and other pressures continue to mount, it is entirely feasible for Buddhism and other religions in the world to simply become history. However, I remain hopeful that that will not happen, at least in my own lifetime. But I do think it's a real danger.
As far as Omamori being unsupported in the text, it still kind of is because it's almsgiving. It's not directly supported, but it is an adjustment of a doctrine that already exists. And it's also worth noting that religions are made up of people, and when people are met with an existential threat like this, they make compromises. So it's the same with religions as well. So, there's a matter of I'm paying for a promise of a supernatural effect that I'm kind of leery of, just as an anti-capitalist. That rubs me the wrong way. But also, I want these temples to continue existing, so it seems like an acceptable compromise made to, continue existing.
I agree completely, and I think that that's a really good point, especially the one about religions being made up of people, and these adaptations not necessarily being internally textually consistent, but being central around the fact hey, I want this temple to stay open. I don't believe that when I buy these Omamori myself that I'm perpetuating some sort of supernatural force in my life. I think that I'm just helping my temple stay open so I can go and hang out with my friends there every week. And I think that that is just as valid and just as important of a religious motivation, if not more so, than making sure that everything squares up doctrinally. Because the doctrine is up for debate and interpretation all the time, and there is no squaring it up. There is no reconciling and resolving it perfectly in every single setting, because it's not designed that way, it's not presented that way, and it's not consumed that way. The more important point is, as you say, in the world that we live in right here, right now, just giving alms or making sure that our community spot stays open, even if we have to participate in this sort of capitalist-coded transaction in order to do so. I am also obviously put off by the capitalism of it all, but I still do it because, like I said, it's the world we live in now, and it's what has to be done in order to keep my temple open. And I'm more than happy to do that. And then at the same time, those who can and those who are in a position to, I also always encourage donations just outright. Not necessarily buying something, but just saying, I want the doors to stay open. Here's a donation of $100 for the year or something like that. And that absolutely keeps the community going, keeps Buddhism alive, if that's what you're donating to, or to your church or of your particular chosen religion. That stuff always helps because, like I said, identity is moving away from religious identity and moving towards these sort of affiliations, these product affiliations, these consumption affiliations. And as problematic as that is in a grand universal scheme, it's sort of what we have to work with even as religion continues to exist. And so since we can't do anything about it, we might as well sort of at least make use of it to perpetuate those things that are fulfilling our spiritual needs, like churches, temples, and so on.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion of Omamori. Join us next week where we will discuss unknowing in Buddhism. What is unknowing in Buddhism? Is it the same as agnosticism? What is its relationship to faith? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.